welcome everybody to week 8 out of 13. And this time I remember it's 13 weeks, not 12, like I said a few weeks ago. So, 14, but one we're not meeting. So it's only 13-week class because Thanksgiving Eve does not count. So tonight we are going to be focusing on starting with chapter 8, right? Yeah. Chapter 8 and a little bit into chapter 9. Good. This is what we've seen so far. You've seen a lot of comparisons. The author of Hebrews has been doing a lot of comparing. Remember the very beginning showed how Jesus was superior to the angels, and then talked about Jesus being superior to Moses and some of the other prominent figures. And we spent a lot of time talking about how Jesus' priesthood, last week in the order of Melchizedek, Jesus' priesthood is superior to the Aaronic priesthood or the Levitical priesthood. Same thing, meaning descended from Aaron or from the tribe of Levi, either one. But the priesthood, the human priesthood that was in place there. Tonight, we're going to talk about the covenant, all right? The covenant that Jesus brings along with him, this new covenant. And the author is going to be making that comparison by showing how the new covenant is superior to the old covenant. In doing that, this is going to be a lot more of a history lesson than some of the others. We've kind of touched on some of what the old covenant sacrificial system was like. The author is going to, at least in an overview fashion, kind of walk through that in some of these verses we're going to talk about tonight. So you'll get to see, hopefully, more than any other night, maybe see those parallels between Jesus' sacrifice and how, well, for example, Jesus said he did not come to abolish the law, to fulfill the law, right? Tonight, hopefully by the end, you'll see what he means by that, how his sacrifice actually is the perfect fulfillment of what the Old Testament sacrificial system was supposed to be doing. So the new covenant isn't some whole new thing. It was all set up by the old, but the old was imperfect, and therefore Jesus came along to fulfill it, to make it come to fruition in the way it really was designed or needed to happen. All right? So we're starting here in chapter 8 with chapter 8, verse 1. And again, this is kind of our summary of what we've just been talking about. So this is your transition. If you don't remember last week or you weren't here last week, this is what we were talking about last week. So now the main point of what we are saying is this. We do have such a high priest who sat down at the right hand of the throne of the majesty in heaven. All right? That was the point of what we read before, right? That Jesus is our high priest. He was a high priest in this order of Melchizedek, taking after this Old Testament figure of Melchizedek, who was around before Levi was even born, so he couldn't have been descended from Levi, and yet he was described as being both a king and a priest of God Most High. And we saw how that kind of prefigured Jesus in a way. And so, but it also shows, even if you ignore the fact that it's a prefiguration of Christ, it shows that it was possible to be a priest of God without being descended from Levi, because Melchizedek was one, all right? So that wasn't a disqualifying factor for Jesus, all right? But then it also talks about that we have a high priest who sat down at the right hand of the throne of the majesty in heaven. Think about that. So Jesus, after he completed his sacrifice, remember, is described as having ascended to heaven and sitting down at the right hand of the Father. And we talked a little bit before about how you cannot describe any of the earthly priests that way. Number one, they didn't have that close proximity to the Father, did they? I mean, they're never described as sitting down at God's right hand. I mean, literally, Jesus wants to talk to the Father. You just kind of, hey, how you gonna nudge him, That was not the relationship, obviously, of the priest high priest could only enter the most holy place one time a year. We'll talk about that a little bit tonight. Also, we see that Jesus, and we talked a little bit about this, sat down, meaning his work was finished. You could never describe the Old Testament priesthood that way. They kept having to make sacrifices over and over and over and over again because people kept sinning, right? So this is kind of a summary of some of the reasons the author has shown us that Jesus' priesthood was superior to any human priest that was serving under the Old Covenant. And then we get to verse 2. And who serves in the sanctuary, the true tabernacle set up by the Lord, not by a mere human being. All right? And there's going to be a little bit more discussion of this as we go on. But remember we talked about this as well a little bit, that the temple, well, first there was the tabernacle, which was the portable tent that they took around the wilderness with them. And then, of course, once they kind of settled in Jerusalem, there was the permanent structure, the temple that was built. The pattern for both was the same, all right? But that sanctuary, that temple, that tabernacle, wasn't just something just God made up because, I don't know, he didn't consult an interior designer and say, hey, what's going to look cool, all right? It was meant in some way to be a reflection of something that exists in heaven, of something that, what it's like to exist in the presence of God. Now, is it an exact replica of something that exists in heaven? No. Why? God is spirit, right? We see this in John 4:24. John is spirit, and his worshipers must worship in spirit and in truth. So we have this spiritual sanctuary in heaven that God was trying, through the Old Covenant, to communicate to his people kind of what it's like to be in the presence of God. And again, this is a theme the author will hit on more and more as we go through these verses tonight. But he was trying to show the glory of God and the seriousness of coming before him and how unsuitable it is for sin to be in his presence. And so God gave very, very specific instructions about how to construct this tabernacle, about how to construct this temple. The reason for that is because it was meant to depict what the real one is, or the real presence of God is like up in heaven, which, again, earthly priests are only serving in this replica down here on earth. Jesus ascends to the true thing, the real deal, so to speak. All right. And then verse 3, every high priest is appointed to offer both gifts and sacrifices. So it was necessary for this one, meaning Jesus, to also have something to offer. Roles have to mean something, right? So when Jesus is described as our priest, that means he has to be operating in some way as a priest. What did priests do? Priests offered sacrifices. Therefore, if we're saying Jesus was a priest, then he had to offer something. That means he was there to offer something. What did he offer? His life, himself, right? Yeah. And so because he didn't offer these imperfect sacrifices that they did, but because he was described as being a priest, and because we knew that a new priest was going to be coming from the Old Testament prophecy, we knew that something had to be sacrificed by this priest, and it had to be something of a different sort. Otherwise, what's distinguishing him from every other priest that's out there? All right? And then we get to verse 4. If he were on earth, he would not be a priest, for there are already priests who offer gifts prescribed by the law. Why would Jesus not have been allowed to be one of the earthly priests here in Jerusalem at his time? He wasn't from the tribe of Levi. Exactly. By birth alone, he would not have been allowed to be a priest. He came from the tribe of Judah. All right? Therefore, they say these priests offer gifts prescribed by the law, meaning the Old Testament law, the Sinaitic law, the law that was given on Mount Sinai, all right? Whatever kind of priest Jesus was, because he wasn't descended from Levi, had to be something different. It couldn't be just one of these priests that was described in that law, because if you look at the law that was given on Mount Sinai, God says, priests have to be descended from Aaron, meaning from the tribe of Levi. So obviously, if Jesus was going to be a priest as well, it couldn't have been that kind of priest. It couldn't have been a priest who was serving under that portion of the law, that old covenant. And then we go on, verse 5. They serve at a sanctuary that is a copy and shadow of what is in heaven. This is why Moses was warned when he was about to build a tabernacle. See to it that you make everything according to the pattern shown you on the mountain. If God said use purple curtains, and Moses thought that clashed with the color of the tent, or with the color of XY, or the color of the lampstand, he was not free to consult an interior decorator and change it to mauve. I don't know what color is mauve. That's a color, right? I don't know. I think in primary colors. My wife hates me for this. It's like no. There's red, there's purple, there's light purple, there's dark purple. There's not different colors. Okay, but anyway. But because remember, this was, while we're not going so far as to say, yes, this is a literal copy of something that's existing in heaven. That's kind of doing a disservice to what God's nature is as spirit. But it was meant to depict a heavenly reality. And that's why it was very, very important that Joseph? I'm combining Joseph and Moses. That Moses do exactly what he was told. All right. God said, make it this way. You make it that way. All right. No representation obviously is going to be perfect, but think about it. If there's anybody in existence who's most capable of saying, okay, so here's what this heavenly reality is like. I want to try to communicate that as best as possible within the limitations of the physical earth. Gee, what's the best way to do that? How about we pick someone who actually has been in that heavenly reality and knows what it's like? All right. It's kind of like if you were trying to describe, could any of you describe what it looks like in my living room? No, because none of you have been in my living room, okay? So you are not equipped to do that. You haven't been in my living room, have you? No, okay. I had to think for a minute. All right, so because you haven't been there, all right? So how presumptuous would it be not to be very meticulous in obeying God's every intricate command on something like this when it's supposed to be describing his abode, all right, his place, his crib. All right. Verse 6, but in fact, the ministry Jesus has received is as superior to theirs as the covenant of which he is a mediator is superior to the old one, since the new covenant is established on better promises. And here's where we start to see this transition now from priesthood is better to let's talk about the covenant that he comes in. It says the new covenant that Jesus is bringing into being is superior to the old covenant. If we look back on a lot of the points that the author has made to this point in the book, you can see at least 5 different ways that they've already established that the new covenant is superior to the old. All right. Number 1, Jesus' ministry and the new covenant he initiated are superior because they fulfill and replace the old covenant priest's ministry. All right. So we take this old covenant and we see Jesus says, I came to fulfill the law, not to abolish the law. It's the natural conclusion of what they were doing. All right. Number 2, Jesus' ministry in this new covenant lasts forever. Why? Because Jesus is God. Remember, we talked about how Jesus' ministry lasts forever. He is a priest forever in the order of Melchizedek, is what we've talked about. So if Jesus is going to live forever and be our priest forever, that means this covenant that he's presiding over is a forever covenant. There's not going to be a newer covenant. There's the old covenant, the new covenant, and that's the end of these covenants. All right? Also, Jesus' ministry and the new covenant are completely sufficient, so we no longer need to keep repeating sacrifices. Remember, and this is something the author is going to hit on even more about why those Old Testament sacrifices were insufficient. But we've already talked a little bit about the fact that you just have to keep repeating them. You sacrifice a lamb or a goat or a bull, and even if we were to assume that that was good enough to actually pay the price that's due for your sin, it wasn't. But even if we assume it was, it only would be sufficient up till that point. And then you would go on and you'd sin again, and you'd have to offer another sacrifice, all right? And you'd sin again, and you offer another sacrifice. Oh, and let's not forget, sometimes you don't even remember what sins you've committed, or you did them unintentionally, which is why we had to have the Day of Atonement once a year, where the high priest goes in and offers a sacrifice for all y'all for things you don't even remember, and you didn't offer a sacrifice for on your own, all right? It's the catch-all sacrifice, all right? That's not necessary with Jesus. Why? Because Jesus is worth a whole heck of a lot more than a bull or a lamb. Jesus is God. There's literally no end to his value, no end to his worth, which means his sacrifice is sufficient to cover all sins everywhere from all people, past, present, future. All right? And that's important to remember because even Old Testament saints, people ask me sometimes, well, what about people who died before Jesus was around? If you have faith, and we'll see this when we get into verse 11 or chapter 11 about some examples of faith, if people exhibited faith in God throughout that time, then Jesus' sacrifice was of sufficient worth to atone for them as well, to be effective for them as well. All right, number 4, these sacrifices, Jesus' sacrifice, truly atones for sin, which the Old Testament sacrifices could not do. They never were intended to, and that's a point the author is going to expand on more here in a minute. These Old Testament sacrifices were always just intended to show people their sin, show them the seriousness of sin and the penalty that's owed, and kind of get them accustomed to this so that they would recognize the one sufficient sacrifice when it actually came up. We talked about this before. If Jesus had just plopped down to earth and there had been no old covenant, people would be looking at him cross-eyed, all right? Nobody would buy it. Nobody would understand because they wouldn't have that context, that frame of reference to understand what he was doing, all right? And the other thing, and this is a big one, that shows why the new covenant is superior to the old. How many people here in the past, I'll cut you some slack, we'll say last week, have prayed to God? You take that for granted. That's because of the new covenant. Because you now have direct access to God. This is another theme the author is going to hit on in these coming verses, all right? That was not the case before. Everything was representative, all right? You had to go through a priest. Even if you wanted to offer a sacrifice because you were sorry for your sin, you couldn't just repent to God and expect it to be handled. You had to bring a sacrifice to the priest, and the priest had to act for you, all right? And so everything was you had to go through an intermediary in order to approach God, all right? Under the new covenant, that's not the case anymore. That separation between us and God is no longer there. We can actually have a closer, intimate relationship with him. All right. Verse 7. For if there had, this is just the logic of it, right? The logical argument. For if there had been nothing wrong with that first covenant, no place would have been sought for another. I mean, we look even while the old covenant was going on, right? You had prophets writing, there's going to be another one. If the old covenant was good enough and was perfectly fine, why would God replace it? Or to use the old colloquialism, if it ain't broke, don't fix it, right? Why would God fix it if it wasn't broke? It was broke. It was never intended to be final, all right? That doesn't mean it was worthless, and this is where a lot of people get confused, all right? It doesn't mean it was pointless. People say, well, if it wasn't any good, why did God do it in the first place? It had a purpose. Its purpose just wasn't to be the final be-all and end-all of our atonement, all right? Its purpose was, like we've talked about, to get people ready for this, to use what they were used to in their surrounding cultures, twist it a bit so that it would point to Jesus. All right, to bring people along so we'd be able to, frankly, have Christianity today. Not the magazine, the religion today. Really? Come on, people. You are a tough crowd tonight. Please tell me somebody in this room has heard of the magazine Christianity Today. Thank you. All right. Verse 8. But God found fault with the people and said, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the people of Israel and with the people of Judah. This second part is kind of what we already talked about. He said there was a new one coming, but I want to focus on that first part of that verse. But God found fault with the people under the old covenant we're talking about. Think about it. The old covenant was based on obedience to the law. That was the whole premise, is that God laid down these rules that you were supposed to follow, and then inevitably you couldn't follow them. Matter of fact, that was the whole point, so people would realize they couldn't follow them, all right? Lay down these rules, you're supposed to follow them, and then when you inevitably don't, you have to make sacrifices to make up for the fact that you didn't manage to follow the law, all right? Which means the entire system was based upon God continually finding you to be at fault, because you were continually at fault. You kept messing up under this old covenant system. So that's why it says God found fault with the people. Yes, that was the nature of the system back then. They had to come to realize that they could not live up to this perfect standard, which would be what was necessary for them to live in unity with God. So instead, God promised he was going to bring about a new covenant, one that was no longer fundamentally based upon obedience to an external law. Instead, it was based upon an inner reconciliation. It was an insight. It wasn't, there's all these laws outside of us that we need to obey. It was the Spirit's going to come in and change me in here. All right? Because that's the only way that we could actually accomplish what God wanted to accomplish in the end. All right. Verse 9. It will not be like the covenant I made with their ancestors when I took them by the hand to lead them out of Egypt, because they did not remain faithful to my covenant, and I turned away from them, declares the Lord. Has anybody ever heard of, there's many descriptions of what hell is like, all right? And there's much disagreement about what the nature of hell is. But one thing that just about everybody agrees with is that hell is defined by a separation from God. That's the whole point, is that God is perfect, all right? Imagine if you had a perfectly white sheet. I mean, one of these bed sheets that's just bleached out the wazoo, right? And it comes out and it's gorgeous. And then I walk up to it with a black ink pen. Yeah, uh-oh. How many of you would try to tackle me before I got to that white sheet, right? And it doesn't matter if it's the smallest speck in the world. It can be the tiniest dot. From now on, every single time you look at that sheet, where are your eyes going to go? Right to the dot, right? God's the white sheet, you're the dot. Except you're actually more like a giant bucket filled with black ink that you're like splashing on it, okay? And so that's the point. That's why we need to not be that dot if we want to live eternally with God, all right? So the whole point was to teach the people this, but that's the consequence of sin. Sin means you don't get to be a part of that sheet. You don't get to be in unison with that white sheet, all right? Because you're still a black dot, all right? The consequence is then you need to be separated. All right. So the consequence of sin is separation from God. That's why God describes it as saying, I turned away from them. There is a separation. And that's, I think I mentioned this in a class before. That's what you see throughout the entire Bible, from the moment of the fall of Adam and Eve. In the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve are described as living in communion with God, walking along with him, right? Then the fall happens, and they get cast out. And then from then on, what do we see? We see God gradually coming closer and closer to us. Not us going to God. As a matter of fact, the one time we tried to go closer to God, it was called the Tower of Babel, didn't work out real well, did it? All right? That's the whole point, is we can't approach him. He needs to approach us. But once that fall happened, there was a separation, where we're over here, God's over here. And then God comes to the top of a mountain, all right? And then he comes to the most holy place. We'll talk about that, the Holy of Holies in the temple, all right? And then he actually takes on human form and walks among us. And then you thought you couldn't top that. Wait, God said, hold my beer, watch this, okay? And then he comes in the form of the Holy Spirit and actually indwells the believers' hearts. So the whole point is God is showing how sin separates us from him, but he, through his initiative, is bringing us closer and closer and closer to reconciling that relationship. All right? All right, verse 10. This is the covenant I will establish with the people of Israel. After that time, declares the Lord, I will put my laws in their minds and write them on their hearts. I will be their God, and they will be my people. What we're going to see over the next 3 verses, this verse and the next 2, is the author's describing 4 aspects of the new covenant that distinguish it from the old covenant. All right? The first one is that it provides inward change. Remember, the old covenant was based on outward obedience to these laws that are imposed upon you from the outside. This one is talking about what's going on in here. Hence, I will put my laws in their minds and write them on their hearts. In other words, it doesn't mean that you're instantly going to know every single thing God wants you to know. But what it does mean is that serving him is going to be a joy, not a burden imposed by external rules. All right? In other words, you are not here tonight right now, hopefully, because someone threatened you and told you you're going to jail if you don't come to Ken's class tonight. Right? Nobody did that? I'm assuming. Hopefully it's a safe assumption. All right? You all made the choice to be here. All right? That's because God's put his laws on your minds and written it on your hearts, all right? Because you had a desire to be here, to learn more about him, all right? That was not the way the old covenant worked, all right? New covenant also, number 2, provides intimacy with God. This phrase here, I will be their God and they will be my people, all right? Remember, the old covenant, what we just talked about, was based upon finding fault. It was constantly a matter of, here's these rules you're supposed to follow, you're not following them, shame, 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 give me a sacrifice, oh, you broke them again, shame again, all right? There was no intimacy there. It was constantly fault-based, all right? The new covenant is not that. It's meant to restore a relationship, all right? Oh, really? Well, what's the church? Us. The church is not all this. If we came here tomorrow and this whole place burned down, well, I'd be wondering where I'm going to get my next paycheck from. But other than that, we could still be the church, right? These are just trappings, all right? None of this means anything if it's not helping us share the gospel. So these are tools, and they're great tools. We got some wonderful tools here. We are blessed beyond many, many churches out there, and the tools we have available, as long as we're using them to share the gospel. But if we didn't have those tools, they didn't have them in the first century. They still shared the gospel. And frankly, if you look at the growth of the church early on, probably did a better job of it than we're doing, you know? All right, verse 11. No longer will they teach their neighbor or say to one another, know the Lord, because they will all know me, from the least of them to the greatest. All right, so this is number 3. It provides knowledge of God. They will all know me, from the least of them to the greatest. This is what we just talked about. Under the old covenant, you didn't get to personally know God. All right, you knew a priest. All right, and that priest had to be your mediator, had to be your intermediary between you and God. You were not allowed to go to God directly. You couldn't. That all changed. So much so that 1 Peter 2, 5, and 9 both actually describe the fact that all believers are now called priests. You are a priest. Don't know if you knew that, but you are a priest. In the way you are now described as a priest. What is that supposed to be meaning? It means you have direct access to God. You don't need to go through somebody else anymore. You want to pray to God? Pray to God, all right? You want to repent of your sins? Repent of your sins. You don't need to go through a priest in order to accomplish that for you, all right? This also, by the way, just getting into a little bit of our Lutheran history, is one of the reasons Martin Luther believed that the Bible should be available to everyone. Around the time of Martin Luther, the Bible was only available to the clergy, and it was written in Latin, which nobody read except, well, the clergy, okay? And so, they'd be reading it in Latin in church, so you wouldn't even know what was being read, all right? So you were entirely dependent upon the priests and just doing what they told you to do. Martin Luther, that did not sit well with him, and so actually he thought that the masses should have access to it. One of the first things he did after he was excommunicated is he had to hide away for a few years so they didn't kill him, and while he was in hiding, let's use that term kind of loosely, guess what he did? He translated the Bible into German, because he was from Germany, right? And so that was one of the first things he did, was to create a Bible that the lay people would be able to read and have access to. Why? Because we're all priests. The Bible teaches we all should have that direct access to God. Yeah. It really didn't. I mean, that was this. Hold on, my mic's going off on me. The system of penance, the way it worked, is the church at the time of Martin Luther had really devolved to the point where it was very, very works-based. It was very much that you had, kind of like the old covenant, it was very similar. You had to obey this law, and if you didn't, you had to come and you had to confess your offenses to a priest. But instead of giving an animal sacrifice, that priest would assign you penance. He would assign you something to do to make up for the fact that you just sinned, all right? The theology is a bit different today, so penance doesn't quite, they don't see it quite the same way today. But then, of course, what would happen is, what kind of penance could you be ordered to do? You could be ordered to do good deeds. You could be ordered to do prayers. It could be suggested, why don't you pay some money to the church? Because after all, isn't giving money to the church a good thing? Come on, let's all say yes. Come on, it's November. This is the month where we always talk about stewardship, right? All right, yes, it's a good thing to give money to the church. And so that was kind of the seed, kind of a lot of things, the way the devil works, right? Starts out as something good, but then they said, well, wait a minute. If you could just, pay money to the church, then how about we sell indulgences, which were get out of jail free cards, so you come, you sin, you're confessing your sin to the priest, but now instead of having to do the penance, you can say, oh, well, I kind of took care of that in advance because I bought this indulgence. It did. It is still there. It is there, but the Catholic Church today does put a higher priority on grace than they did back then. So it's still, yeah. So it's not quite the same function, but it is, you are still assigned a penance and everything, and you confess your sins. So, all right. Yeah, it can be something like that. It's more looked at today as more of a healing for you as opposed to paying a price, if that makes sense. All right, and then verse 12, for I will forgive their wickedness and will remember their sins no more. All right, the fourth thing that the new covenant does is superior to the old is it provides complete forgiveness for sins. All right, complete. It's finished, it's done. The blood of animals was never meant to truly pay the price for our sin. Why? Because an animal ain't a human. All right, like it or not, animals were not made in the image of God. You were. All right. So when you sin and the penalty for sin is death, then the penalty that's owed is a human death, the death of something that was made in the image of God. An animal sacrifice does not do that, does not accomplish that. It was never intended to accomplish that. All right. So that's what the author is saying, is that was always insufficient. All right. But Jesus' sacrifice, it's kind of like if, I hate to say this, but let's talk about a scale of worth, a scale of value. Here's our humans, okay? We're made in the image of God. Below us are animals because they ain't. And the one that makes the sacrifice for us is God himself. Way up there, okay? Far superior to our own value, merit, if you want to call it that. And so because of that, God will remember our sins no more. Under the new covenant, God wipes out the memory of sins as if they had never happened. For those of you that were here this past Sunday, that's something that I can probably tell I feel pretty passionately about. Because I do have people that come up to me quite often, and they're still carrying guilt for something they've done. And here's the thing, if you have faith in Jesus and you've confessed that, stop it. The only guilt you should be feeling, the only guilt you are feeling is that guilt that you're putting upon yourself. Because God has erased it. God's not remembering it. You've confessed it. It's done. It's paid for. And it's almost a weakness on our part because when we continue to feel guilty about it, it's almost like we're calling into question the sufficiency of Jesus' sacrifice for us. All right? So we need to try to stop doing that. All right. Verse 13. By calling this covenant new, he has made the first one obsolete. And what is obsolete and outdated will soon disappear. All right? This should be readily obvious to anybody who ever has owned a computer because they go obsolete in about 30 days before they make a new one. I'm exaggerating a little bit. All right? And then they stop providing upgrades and software for them, and so you can't even use them anymore. They become obsolete, right? So this is our 2,000 years before computers, computer analogy here that Jesus was foreshadowing. No, but I mean, that's the whole point, is if Jesus fulfilled the old covenant, it wasn't just two covenants that are in sequence. It wasn't like there was an old one and then there was a brand new one. This new one was related to the old, and that's what I love about this book of Hebrews, is because you see that connection. There is a relationship there, and it fulfilled the old one. Well, if it's been fulfilled, then there's really no point to it anymore, is there? It's done. It's over. Move on. And did something happen, anybody know their first century history, after this book was written, that kind of made that point pretty emphatic that the Old Testament sacrificial system was over. It was done. It was obsolete. The temple was destroyed in 70 AD. There literally was no more place for the Jews to make their sacrifices. And the temple wasn't rebuilt until, let me think about this, ever. It has not been rebuilt to this day. All right? So that alone also shows you what's being illustrated here, that whole old covenant system is obsolete now. It serves no purpose. If God still thought it was necessary, do you think he would have allowed the temple to be destroyed and stay destroyed for 2,000 years? No. All right? All right, so here's where we get into our verses, chapter 9. We're moving into chapter 9, and here's where we're going to talk a little bit about what the old covenant system was like and what was happening. I don't know if you can see this little picture, but you can find pictures of the inside of the tabernacle, the holy place and the most holy place all over the internet, but I will try to at least describe what's going on here, all right? Because now in verse 9, the author is starting to describe what that old covenant system was like. It So now the first covenant had regulations for worship and also an earthly sanctuary. A tabernacle was set up. In its first room were the lampstand and the table with its consecrated bread. This was called the holy place. All right, so what we don't have, the author is just talking about these two inner rooms that are kind of inside, all right, underneath the shelter of the tent or later indoors of the temple. The actual altar where the sacrifices were offered is actually just outside here, and there's a large temple court out there. There's other stuff that goes on out there, but that's not what we're worried about. We're just worried about inside the tent. Inside that tent, there are two rooms. All right. There's the outer room, which you come in here. This is a larger outer room, which would generally called the holy place. And there's a smaller inner room in the back called the most holy place. All right, or the holy of holies. You'll hear it referred to sometimes. All right. We're going to kind of work our way back, and they're describing what was in each one and what the purpose of them was. The first thing the author talks about was a lampstand is in the first room. You've probably heard the word menorah. All right, that's what it was. All right, it was a menorah. You can see it depicted here. The purpose of the menorah was, well, because you need light. All right, if I were to turn off all the lights in this room, would you be able to see? No, this is inside. Same thing holds the true, but they didn't have electricity. All right, so you have a menorah that, number one, is designed to keep the place lit. That's why it has so many candles. All right. It also does symbolize the presence of God. God is seen as light. And so the fact that that is what's providing the light is seen as the presence of God. Also, it talks about a table with its consecrated bread. All right? There was a table, and kind of shown over here against this far wall, a table inside the holy place where they would place 12 loaves of bread every Sabbath, so every Saturday by our reckoning. All right? And that bread was meant to symbolize how God provided for his people's physical needs. And it could only be eaten by the priest. All right, but this is something every Saturday they had to go in and they had to replace the bread. All right? Then verse 3, we say, behind the second... Wait, did I skip one? Hold on. First... Okay, no. All right. Behind the second curtain, so we have this other curtain here, was a room... Yeah, wait a minute. I didn't mention the incense. Yeah, there we go. Okay. Okay. There we go. Right, okay. Behind the second curtain was a room called the Most Holy Place, which had the golden altar of incense and the gold-covered Ark of the Covenant. All right. This ark contained the gold jar of manna, Aaron's staff that had budded, and the stone tablets of the covenant. All right. So there is a curtain here. This is kind of a cutaway. You're not seeing the whole thing. This curtain goes all the way across. The idea is nobody can even see in there. So it blocks the entrance, so you're not, even the priests that come out here to serve in the holy place aren't even allowed to look at the most holy place. And God is thought to actually reside here in this small room. All right? So that curtain was meant to actually not just be a physical obstruction to prevent you like a doorway, but also a visual obstruction, so you couldn't even see in there. Inside that room, all right, there is the gold incense altar, all right? The gold incense altar, well, it's talked about, it's by the curtain. It's not actually in the holy, it's not in the most holy place. It's just outside the curtain, just outside that most holy place. There is the gold incense altar, which is burned twice daily, all right? Now, eventually, I don't know if this was always intended because the Bible's a little unclear on this, but it did eventually come to be seen as symbolizing the prayers of the people. So if you think about it, anybody burn incense? I'm a huge incense fan. And you start burning it, everything smells great, but you can see the smoke rising up, right? And so twice daily they would go in and they would have to light this incense and burn this incense, and the smoke going up was meant to symbolize the prayers of the people going up to God. Again, you couldn't do it on your own. The symbolism here is the priest is actually the one sending your prayers up to God, because unless you go through the priest, it ain't getting there. God's not hearing you, okay? Then we also have the Ark of the Covenant, which currently resides, I believe, in a warehouse somewhere ever since World War II. But they won't tell you where. Somebody gets the joke. I saw a few of you out there. All right. One of the best movies of all time. Come on, people. Dun, 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 dun. That's why I wear my hats, yes. That is what, I mean, I wear fedoras all the time now, but yes, I'm a child of the 80s. Indiana Jones got me started wearing fedoras, and now I have a whole collection. All right. So we have the Ark of the Covenant. The Ark of the Covenant, some of the things it talks about, first of all, it talks about the stone tablets of the covenant, the Ten Commandments, all right? The tablets of the Ten Commandments were kept inside the Ark, all right? We also, and what would happen, because the Ten Commandments were kept in there, the symbolism here is the Ark is supposed to symbolize God's covenant. It symbolizes this old covenant with the people. And so on the Day of Atonement, remember that one day a year, where only the high priest was allowed to enter this room, all right? And he would first offer a sacrifice for himself, for his own sin, and then he would offer a sacrifice for the unknown or unintentional sins of the people. He would actually sprinkle the blood of that sacrifice on the lid of the Ark of the Covenant, all right? The Ark also contained, it talks about Aaron's staff that had budded and a gold jar of manna. You might not remember the story. It's from Numbers 17, 1 through 11. This is kind of was God showing people, when I say I want Aaron to be my priest, yes, this is the one whose staff is going to bud is going to be, my high priest. And Aaron's staff grew buds. That was evidence that this was actually God's action, God's approval of Aaron as priest. And so that staff was also kept in the ark, as was manna. A symbolism, again, a remembrance of how God provided for them when they were wandering in the wilderness. Now, above the ark were the cherubim of the glory overshadowing the atonement cover. The atonement cover is the lid, right? Remember I said that's because he sprinkles the blood on the cover, providing atonement for sins. That's why it's called the atonement cover. Atonement is forgiveness. It's a fancy biblical word for forgiveness, all right? So above the ark were the cherubim of the glory overshadowing the atonement cover, but we cannot discuss these things in detail now. Cherubim are mighty angels. So when you see described as two cherubim, it's meaning there were statues of two angels attached to the top of the atonement cover. All right? Cherubim are very powerful angels. They're often guards. It was cherubim who are said to be guarding the entrance to the Garden of Eden after Adam and Eve were cast out. All right? So here there were two of them covering the top of the ark, symbolizing almost like they were... I mean, if you think about it, you've got like some real big ruler. They've always got their guards right next to them. Think of it that way. And so these cherubim were depicted there to symbolize this is the presence of God. Now you are in the presence of God. This is where God is in this most holy place. Meaning the author's just going to move on. Because remember, the author is talking to a Jewish audience. And so this is kind of a very cursory look at it. Because he knows his audience already knows these things. And so it's like, we're not going to spend any more time going into detail about things you already know about. Yeah. All right. When everything had been arranged like this, the priests entered regularly into the outer room to carry on their ministry. Not just the high priest, but they actually had a rotation. So priests from around the nation would actually come and spend do 2-week shifts where they would get to come and serve in the actual temple. All right, and then they would go back and they would serve in their hometowns. But they wouldn't get to go to the most holy place, just to the holy place, just to that outer room. Now, some of the things they would have to do in there, well, they'd have to burn the incense, or get that going twice a day. They'd have to put the loaves out on the Sabbath and take the new ones in and eat them. They'd have to make sure those candles kept burning, trimming the wicks or whatever, keep that light. That light was burning 24/7. So these are some of the things continuous things that the Old Testament priest had to keep doing. All right, and again, remember just a few verses ago, the author described Jesus' Christ priesthood as now he is seated. He's sitting down. It's again another contrast with the new covenant versus the old. The new covenant, Jesus made his one sacrifice once for all. It is finished. I get to sit now. Whereas the Old Testament priesthood was a litany of different tasks that had to be done over and over and over and over again because it was never adequate to actually atone for sins in the first place. All right. But only the high priest entered the inner room, the Holy of Holies, the most holy place. And that only once a year, and never without blood, which he offered for himself and for the sins the people had committed in ignorance. Again, the whole point to all these regulations is to show that we as sinners are unfit to enter into the presence of God. Sin cannot, we're that black dot, all right? Sin cannot coexist with a perfect God. And so God's trying to show us all these regulations about what we had to do just to even offer these sacrifices, just to offer this Day of Atonement once a year sacrifice, all right? Only one person, and then we had to go through all these other things, all these steps. He had to sacrifice for his own sins and all of this before we could actually do it, all right? The idea was it would hammer this point home, that over time they would realize, well, to quote Wayne's World, I'm not worthy, I'm not worthy. I got the movie references coming. We're going to keep them going here, all right? Well, and by the end, when it's time over, I'll do an E.T. reference about going home. No. All right. Verse 8, the Holy Spirit was showing by this that the way into the most holy place had not yet been disclosed as long as the first tabernacle was still functioning, all right? Because, remember, the most holy place is where God was seen to reside. So by saying the way into the most holy place had not been disclosed, that meant the way into the presence of God. You couldn't communicate directly with God. You couldn't directly approach God. And that as long as this old covenant system is going on, it's reinforcing that fact. If these Christian Jews go back to their Judaism, essentially what they're saying is, oh, I guess we really can't approach God anymore. It is the ultimate denial of Jesus' sacrifice. It's the denial of the whole point of Jesus' sacrifice. It was in order to reconcile, so now they can approach God directly. It's almost like saying, you know what, Angie, I like talking to you face to face, but yeah, from now on I'm just going to write you letters. I mean, why? I mean, other than we like getting mail. Nobody gets mail anymore, right? But seriously, if you could communicate with someone face to face, why would you say, well, now we're only going to write little handwritten letters from now on? Why would you go back to that? But that's what the author is pointing out. They're doing. Okay, you don't like talking to people? I know that all the time. It's not just texting too. It's like Discord. They get a Discord. Yeah, literally. It's one thing if they're not together, but yeah, I've seen them literally walking right next to each other. Oh, we're talking to each other. Yeah, I know. It's like, seriously? The point is that you have more direct access to God now. Why would you go back to saying, no, we have to keep that separate? We have to re-separate ourselves from him. All right? Verse 9, this is an illustration for the present time, indicating that the gifts and sacrifices being offered were not able to clear the conscience of the worshiper. Again, the old covenant sacrifices symbolized atonement. They pointed to the future, to the perfect atonement that was going to come. But ultimately, they were futile. They were not accomplishing what people may have thought they were accomplishing. All right? The whole point was to bring about the new covenant. And that new covenant now would effectively cleanse us from our sins. Old covenant never did. All right? It never actually cleansed us from sin. It just was meant to get us to realize our need to be cleansed from sin and the seriousness of sin and how separated we are from God because of sin, so that now when the new covenant comes, God could actually put into place something that was effective, that would actually accomplish that. And last but not least, verse 10, they are only a matter of food and drink and various ceremonial washings, external regulations applying until the time of the new order. If you were to sum up the fundamental difference between the old covenant and the new covenant, it would be this. The old covenant was external, the new covenant is internal. The old covenant was entirely based on external behaviors, all right? The new covenant is based upon your internal heart and who you are. And God's going to send his actually spirit inside you to dwell inside you, okay? I love that stuff. Maybe I'm a geek, but I just I like history in general, especially biblical history, and I love seeing those connections. So it gives you a better understanding of what God's big picture is. I'm sure you've heard before that the Bible is 66 books of one overarching story from Genesis through Revelation. And when you study things like this, you start to see how the chapters, just like a good story, right? The chapters are building on each other. Too often, I think we focus so much on the new covenant, we don't see how the groundwork for it was being laid throughout that whole Old Testament, all right? So next week, we are going to pick up where we were here in verse 11 of chapter 9, and we're going to get through part of chapter 10. So it's about the equivalent of another chapter, but just kind of halfway through. All right?